By the mid-1st century AD, Rome had seen tyrants, madmen, and murderers. But Nero was something new, a dictator who wanted to be adored not for conquest or power, but for performance. From the moment he became emperor at just 17, Nero was obsessed with art. He loved poetry, theater, and music more than governing. He didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to captivate it. Ancient historians tell us he truly believed he was touched by divine inspiration, a living Apollo. But to everyone else, Nero's passion for performing wasn't inspiring. It was terrifying. A city held hostage by talent as emperor, Nero could do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted was applause. He began hosting private recitals inside his palace, where senators, generals, and ambassadors were invited to attend. Once the doors were locked, the performance began, and it didn't stop until Nero said so. He'd sing for hours, reciting tragic poetry in his nasal voice, playing the lyre, and expecting thunderous applause at every pause. One historian claimed people fainted from exhaustion trying to cheer loud enough. Another said some pretended to die so they could be carried out, only to be caught and forced to return once they revived. And yet, no one dared laugh. No one dared leave, because this was the man who had already murdered his mother. The dark side of art. Nero's obsession with music wasn't just vanity, it was an addiction. He trained with professional performers, practiced endlessly, and performed in costume, insisting everyone address him as Nero the artist. He demanded the same reverence for his singing that others gave to Jupiter. Anyone who mocked him risked exile, torture, or execution. It wasn't enough to rule Rome. He wanted to be loved by it, loudly, theatrically, and on command. Senators learned to fake enthusiasm. Courtiers competed to praise him. The entire empire became an audience trapped in an endless show. The Rome that couldn't laugh behind the marble and gold, Rome was terrified. Some sources describe entire banquets where Nero performed song after song while the guests sat sweating, desperate for it to end. One senator supposedly whispered that a single note of Nero's cost more than a legion's pay. Another claimed women gave birth during his concerts because they weren't allowed to leave the hall. No one dared interrupt. No one dared yawn. Applause was survival. Art and ego for Nero, performance was power. He once declared, "When I sing, the gods listen." He built theaters and ordered mass attendance, forcing citizens to fill the seats whether they wanted to or not. When he toured the empire, people lined the streets, not in admiration, but in fear. He expected temples to be built in his honor as the divine singer. And in his own twisted way, Nero believed his art was what held Rome together. He didn't see his music as indulgence. He saw it as civilization itself, proof that his empire was refined, culture divine. Everyone else saw it for what it was, madness wrapped in melody. The audience that couldn't escape, there's a grim humor to it all. An emperor who thought himself a genius while everyone else suffered in silence. Picture it. A marble hall filled with sweating senators, their togas clinging in the heat, trying not to cough as Nero croons through yet another tragic poem about doomed lovers. Guards stand by the doors, spears in hand, ensuring no one leaves. The emperor wipes his brow, smiles faintly, and says, "Encore." You can almost hear the groan of despair under the applause. The early signs of collapse, while Nero sang, Rome crumbled. Corruption spread, generals rebelled, and famine struck. But Nero's world was insulated by theater lights and applause. He saw his empire as an audience, his stage, his spotlight, his divine right. When critics whispered that he was losing control, Nero responded not with reforms or armies, but with a new performance. He was convinced that if the people just heard him, they'd love him. And maybe that's the saddest part. Beneath the ego and absurdity was a man who desperately wanted approval, even as his empire fell apart. Closing of Section 1, so here's where we stand in the first act of Nero's madness. A teenage emperor who believed he was a god of music. Senators trapped in endless recitals, applauding for survival. Citizens forced to worship not a warrior, but a wannabe rock star. and an empire learning that sometimes the deadliest tyrant is the one who refuses to leave the stage. In Section 2, we'll see how Nero's obsession took him beyond Rome, to Greece, to public competitions, and finally, to infamy. Because Nero didn't just want to sing for his people. He wanted the entire world to hear him. A few years earlier, in 64 AD, a fire had consumed most of Rome. For days, flames devoured temples, homes, and markets. Thousands were left homeless. And while the fire raged, rumors spread that Nero was seen standing on his balcony, playing his lyre and singing of the fall of Troy. Rome burns, people whispered, and Nero sings. Modern historians doubt he actually did it, but the image stuck. It was too perfect. The emperor who forced people to listen now had an audience he couldn't ignore, an empire in ruins. The final act by 68 AD, the applause had turned to silence. Rebellion spread. Generals refused to obey. Even his Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Nero fled the city, still clutching a lyre. When he realized there was no escape, he prepared for one last performance. According to legend, his final words were theatrical. "What an artist dies in me." Then he stabbed himself in the throat, ending both his life and his endless concert. The legacy of a performer in the centuries that followed, Nero became a symbol of artistic madness, a man who destroyed an empire chasing applause. Roman writers mocked him as a clown in a crown. Later generations turned him into a cautionary tale of ego without restraint. But strangely enough, Nero also became a kind of dark legend, a man who blurred the line between emperor and entertainer, between ruler and narcissist. Modern psychologists might call it a celebrity complex. Ancient Romans just called it insanity. Why the world remembered the music, the tragedy of Nero, is that he wasn't talentless. Some accounts say he actually had a pleasant voice and played the lyre well. But talent wasn't the problem. It was obsession. He didn't perform because he loved music. He performed because he couldn't live without validation. And so, Rome learned a painful lesson. A leader who needs applause more than truth will burn everything just to hear one more encore. Closing of Section 2, so here's the tally. A man who could have ruled the greatest empire in history. Instead, he ruled the stage and forced the world to watch. He locked senators in rooms until they clapped, sang until cities revolted, and died believing he was a misunderstood genius. Nero wanted to be remembered as an artist. And he was, just not for the reasons he hoped.